Very glad to be here, and thank you for the invitation. This invitation was in a whole year's making. I was slated to come here last year, and I would have given you a completely different talk, and that is Peking Opera and modern dance. But that I have given already, so I wrote a new talk for this occasion, and it is a topic that that sounds very large, ambitious, but it's going to be very concrete. It's a topic I have thought about for many years. The topic is, why did Mei Lanfang go abroad? What is the motivation? Scholars have talked about Mei Lanfang going abroad in terms of as a diplomatic coup representing China, and very much on Mei Lanfang's impact on Western theater. There's quite a bit of scholarship on that. And also on Mei Lanfang's representation of the imagined China for a foreign audience. I myself have worked on that quite a bit. Yet, I think the question is important, the motivation for Mei Lanfang to go abroad, for a variety of reasons. Because the risk was very great. It was extremely expensive, especially the American trip. His reputation is absolutely online. This was the first time where newspapers were simultaneously reporting his trip from New York to China. Tianjin, Shanghai, Beijing, all the newspapers. So it not only is whether or not he's going to succeed abroad, but it's whether or not his image is going to be damaged within China. And this question also leads to, I think these questions are important. The question of what motivated him, and what was the intended and unintended consequences. I think this question leads us to a topic which is the center of my talk today, is what is the internal Chinese environment, the political, cultural setting for Mei Lanfang's going abroad. I think this question has not been dealt with. So we know Mei Lanfang went abroad very famously. Many people have written on it. Three major visits. One is to Japan, 1919, which I will touch upon. One is to the United States, 1930, and one is to the Soviet Union, 1935. They have the stated design have been well known. They want to take Peking Opera to the world stage to be recognized as a world theatrical aesthetic high culture, not local old culture that should be discarded. We know all the three visits were extremely successful, from press release to critics to theater goers. We have plenty of materials to know this. We also know that these visits were highly designed. They took years to organize. It's well orchestrated, well prepared, and they had an intended audience in mind. They were also very highly sponsored. In Japan, we had the highest government level sponsor for Mei Lanfang. Okuda Hachiro is the founder of the Japanese financial conglomerate. He owns the Siberian Railroad at that time. And of course, he is the person who invited Mei Lanfang. In the United States, Woodrow Wilson's, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson was on the list, and who is who in New York is on the list of sponsors for Mei Lanfang. In the Soviet Union, you have a spectrum of all the big leftist artists all went to Moscow to witness this, from Stanislavski, Meyerhold, Brecht, many people have written on that, Craig, Eisenstein, and of course a short film was made. So we have a high level of engagement. The background, coming back to the question I've raised. This background is important because Mei Lanfang went abroad with a total denunciation of Peking Opera by the new cultural elite in China. So Peking Opera was facing two major challenges of the founding of the Republic. 1911, Republic was founded. The actors were extremely active in engaging with Sun Yat-sen. They actually wrote to Sun Yat-sen himself. They wanted to make sure that traditional theater has a role in the new society. Of course, they needed political patronage. This they desperately need to not be discarded. The second thing they desperately need was a 文人 intellectual support in terms of helping them to conceptualize how Peking Opera could be relevant in this new society, could make the transition from representing the traditional society to lead or live in the new society. But this, in these terms, China at that time was not ideal for traditional Chinese opera. We know there's a north-south divide. China did not have a central government strong enough to make any cultural policies at that time. We know Huang Xing visited the actors and so on and so forth. So on the other hand, because of the Versailles Treaty, or even earlier, we have the mainstream Chinese new intellectuals, Hu Shi, Chen Duxiu, leading an attack on old culture. This is the new cultural movement. So traditional Chinese theater was in a kind of a no man's land. That is quite an interesting thing, because out of this decentralization, the patronage of the court is gone. Qing court is the main patronage of Peking Opera. They're gone. Republican government too weak to be a real patron. Out of this is another study I have made, is the rise of the female impersonator. Right? It became culturally actually one of the most lively period until 1927, Chiang Kai-shek consolidated power. So we have a decade and a half of very interesting cultural fermentation from abroad, from below. So in terms of this cultural framework, we know that starting from the late Qing, theater reform was already on the agenda. Chinese theater must reform, right, at that time. But in the teens, early teens, especially around a Peking Opera, Peking University journal called The New Youth, 新青年, started to have an organized series of discussion, and we can also say attack, on traditional Chinese theater. And this attack was very, very, very severe for the survival of Chinese theater, because these are the most learned, young, upcoming new intellectual. So Hu Shi being one of the representatives of this attack, I will quickly summarize this attack. Hu Shi, coming from his articles published coming from an educated in Columbia, philosophy, Dewey, and went back to China, he basically accepts a social Darwin framework he uses for culture. That is, culture is developed from the lowest standard to the highest standard. So the oldest is the most primitive. And Peking Opera, or let's just say traditional Chinese theater, in this so-called scientific structure becomes obsolete. So he calls it 遗形物, the leftover remnants of a past history, right, of the past. And one of the argument he makes is that that Peking Opera has singing, music, and of course only the highest level of theater advancement is realism. Realism in spoken drama. That is the highest level of theater. So in comparison, Peking Opera is obsolete in the new society. Fu Sinian follow-ups with much more comprehensive attack on traditional Chinese theater. He basically uses Western theater theory, very sort of rudimentarily, and talks about the Western theater represent the human action and spirit without any gimmicky tricks. Pure theater, 纯粹戏剧. And in comparison, all traditional Chinese operas represent, not only represent, it's artistic represent, but produced the values of the old society. It is the bedrock of old society's value system. So it is incompatible with modern needs. So that attack, and he goes very, very in detail, the particular formalism in Peking Opera, right, 身段, is old style and is obsolete, is not realistic. Second, the literary quality, 剧本, right, the literary quality is so poor that there's no real standard and no high culture can be achieved. Third, it is basically reactionary. Well, he used that word, right? This is, if you want to look at old society and old value, this is what it represents. And basically, at the end of the article, this traditional theater has to be 铲除, has to be eliminated from the face of earth. He also said, we can't do this yet because people loves it. We, the few intellectuals, cannot. I mean, the state could have, if the state was really, really strong, right, could have done something about that. So we need to try to help to modernize Peking Opera in the short term. So he gives that little short concession. So in the end, he says the highest, like in Hu Shi, the highest register of modern theater is realism without music. So this is the attack on the theater. At the same time, so what I'm trying to create is the cultural intellectual climate in which Mei Lanfang is trying to push for the relevancy and modern aspect of traditional theater. We are talking about real survival here, right? This is really quite an important battle. So the fact that Peking Opera is still alive today has a lot to do with Mei Lanfang, has a lot to do with Peking Opera going abroad. And we will see this as I unfold my argument. So in fact, Mei Lanfang already started a Peking Opera reform. Shanghai started even earlier, but Mei Lanfang is the most famous in his reform. And in particular, another study of mine, which I did last year, is how Mei Lanfang injected dance into Peking Opera as one of the aesthetic systems that will link traditional opera to a modern sensibility of being civilized. This is because in Paris, and Qi Rushan has experienced in the turn of the century, he was there quite a few times and quite a long time. He saw modern dance, modern theater, traditional opera in the 1910s, and ballet russe and so on. And he came back with the idea. Qi Rushan is the man who worked with Mei Lanfang very closely. I'll introduce him a little bit later. He came back with the idea that in order to be modern, you had to have dance in the theater. So not only Qi Rushan and Mei Lanfang's vision and concept of how to modernize Peking Opera is in a direct confrontation to the May 4th New Cultural Movement. Not only they didn't take out the music, they added the dance. So there is two ideas of modernizing Peking Opera. In the vision of Mei Lanfang, it is much more of a European understanding of a total work of art, which was 1910s. The Western theater was also confronted to the dead end of realism and trying, like ballet russe and the Paris opera, they were trying to break through, trying to see how they engaged the mass audience, right? And dance and song was crushed. Of course, this is also the time just after Wagner, which shocked Europe with his opera, with his total theory, total work of art. So in this case, we have actually a big confrontation with the Chinese cultural elite and what's on the ground, Peking Opera, although without a, not at that time, we will say that there was a clear concept of what is modern for Mei Lanfang. At this moment of transition, so Mei Lanfang created, to carry out his first idea, some of you might know 天女散花. 天女散花 is the heavenly maidens showers flower. It's a Buddhist story. It's one of the earlier dance-driven drama. Later on, there are many, many dance-driven drama, including sword dance, all various of dances going in. And what is important that if you look at the rise of the four great dance, the four female impersonators, they all became famous through new operas driven by dance. So the audience responded to this really positively in terms of renovation. We can put it that way. At that time, there is in the newspaper, in this discussion, I just quickly mentioned, there is a theater critic, a Peking University student called Zhang Houzai. He already tended to offer a new theory for Peking Opera. He already used thing of the aesthetics being illusionary, 假象, right? And the acting principle being 抽象, abstract. So he's already using and thinking about using Western concept, how we talk about Peking Opera. At this very moment, 1919. So this discussion started somewhere in 17, 18, and then ended, of course, with the May 4th movement. The May 4th movement erupted the day Mei Lanfang was going to Japan, his first trip to Japan. So it was unfortunate and or fortunate date for Mei Lanfang. So in this picture, so on the contrary, so what we have in this picture, May 4th movement erupted. The discussion on traditional theater ended. The newspapers' critique on traditional theater, this column was eliminated for many newspapers because the challenge was so great that the traditional culture has now sunk the lowest of their, everything was blamed on traditional culture. Everything was blamed on Confucianism. That's all of China's problem was culture. And the discussion not only ended, but that ended a engagement by the Chinese elite. So Peking Opera still needed patronage from the state, patronage, and even more importantly, playwrights, modern playwrights, to write new plays for them that can reflect the new thinking of society. Both avenues were closed at this moment. So, in contrast, just in contrast, Meiji Japan, when the young Meiji emperor came to throne, one of the first decisions he made was that kabuki is going to be national theater. He went to kabuki theater. It was a total cultural policy. He took foreign visitors to kabuki. I'm just trying to contrast why kabuki had a much easier time, thus, in some ways, less transformed because of this continued patronage. New playwrights, because the emperor visited kabuki, started to write kabuki plays. Natsume, and quite a few new playwrights. So they have new plays coming out. And China did not have this situation. In contrast, what happened to Mei Lanfang and his supporters, they noticed foreign theater artists were terribly interested in Peking Opera. Foreign diplomats, foreign delegations, journalists, intellectuals, they were very much in a positive spirit towards Peking Opera. This gave them, Okura actually was one of the Japanese that saw Mei Lanfang perform and say, yes, we want you to come to Japan. So in contrast with the total non-supportive Chinese intelligentsia elites and the much more receptive, much more open-minded Western cultural elite, this triggered the thinking and the possibility that in order for the survival of Chinese traditional opera, the link must be global. The link must be the world, because domestically this was not coming forth. So not only, I think Peking Opera also realized that it needed a dialogue partner to find its own identity. It's swimming in this current of different political and cultural currents. And so in my abstract, I talked about this quite a bit. That is, how to situate itself, how to understand itself, needed a discussion, needed dialogue, and needed stimulus from discussion. So this, in fact, they got from going abroad, instead of having a discussion more like in Japan, with their own intellectual and patronized by their government officials. So in order to go abroad, as I said, it took a long time to arrange, because we have a cultural show you Mei Lanfang for those who have not seen his image. We have a how do you translate traditional Chinese aesthetics into not only a modern dialogue, but to a foreign audience, right? How do you translate this? How do you tailor and how do you present yourself? This is the argument I want to make. Is this through trying to define yourself, define Chinese traditional theater to the outsider, to the alienated viewers and audience, that Peking Opera started to have a narrative of itself. And through this narrative, who are we? And very importantly, through this narrative, traditional Chinese theater gained a history, an aesthetic theory, a theater 身段谱, the artistic movement, pictorial representation, a whole series of that will have long-lasting impact. This in the description, in the described to the other, that Peking Opera started to understand itself and gain not only concept but a theory about itself. So the first trip. So I'm going to focus on. I've written a lot on the three visits, but today what I'm focusing on, how Peking Opera created a canonical text for itself through this discussion. So the first visit to Japan, we started to have various of texts being produced for the visit. This is in Waseda University. So we have, they're quite very good in a theater collection. We have an introduction of the operas that Mei Lanfang is going to perform, right? This is 1919. It's quite early in that sense. We have a list of photographs on Mei Lanfang, which also started to establish the image of the art in the modern perception. So this photograph is very interesting. Mei Lanfang continued forever only wearing, not after 1949, but continued to wear Western outfit. And unlike all of the other stars, everybody dressed in Chinese garb. And so the modernist Mei Lanfang is actually in his clothes very, very clearly. And this is, of course, is a very famous, that is the Tenyu Sanhua, the Buddha story where the goddess sprinkles flowers. You can see the dance already in the program. And what is interesting is that the Mei Lanfang team took a set of programs to Japan. The Japanese chose something totally different. So this is very interesting. And the one thing the Chinese actually was not going to show was Tenyu Sanhua. The most modern, the most deviant from Peking Opera tradition because of the dance. Why did the Japanese insisting on choosing this piece? Not only that is the centerpiece, because dance is the insignia of modernity. And Japan wanted to see an old culture actually revive and become new. And if you look at the program, I've written that something else really interesting, how three countries, Japan, United States, and Soviet Union, they all took their 节目, right, their program, Each country chose something wildly different. There's only one program that they all shared. That is the Drunken Beauty. That is 贵妃醉酒. And that piece is entirely driven by dance. So dance became a very important transcultural possibility, right? That you don't use words. Your aesthetic is not through words, but your aesthetic is through movement. I won't go into that because that's totally another talk. You can see my heartbeat with this dance thing. It's really fascinating, very, very interesting. So we have a choice of the program. We have many, many photographs. I won't go into this. My time is up. But they are all new, looks old, but all new opera, designed for Mei Lanfang. I won't go into this. And then we have an introduction of Mei Lanfang. From 1919, we start to have the real star culture arising, not just from the newspaper, but from a narrative done by the actors themselves, right? And then we have the introduction of the special characteristic of Chinese theater. We already started to have a narrative. What is Chinese theater, right? Coming through here. And then the particular theater, different theater stories are told there. And then we have, of course, in East Asia, intellectual poems being given to the actor. You know, it's all mixed up, right? Very old style poem dedication. And this is by Japanese literati and Chinese literati, their dedication. So we have this. By the time that, so we have a very rudimentary self-narration with Japan. The Qirushan Mei Lanfang team still thought, well, this is an Eastern country. We will have some understanding in terms of theater performance and so on and so forth. But in Japan, what was very interesting, the newspaper focused on Mei Lanfang's dance and psychological acting, right? Which is quite new and for Mei Lanfang. The American visit took 7 years to perform. And I went to the New York Public Library. There were many letters and photographs sent from China to XYZ United States. All the cultural and financial individuals, actually, there are letters and photographs. And in this narration, actually, Peking Opera finally matured its self-image and its place in the modern world. These are some of the beautiful photographs I found in these letters. They're all in the letter format and so on. Mei Lanfang. And then this is Mei Lanfang's 49th Street performance. This is for the press, right? So there he is. And he brought an ensemble of Chinese, but actually in China, he has the same stage arrangement. After 1949, it was all cleared out, because that's not representing tradition. The press was very active in promoting Mei Lanfang. Mei Lanfang gave many lectures before. There was years of reporting Mei Lanfang was going to come. They took every opportunity to talk to the press. And while he was performing, again, the dance were very, very much captured. And of course, American chose totally different program. Not only that, they truncated mostly the dance that they took as a vehicle. So this is a typical book. Many, many versions of this. This was a program given at the thing. You first, at the performance, you were given this big, thick book. This is the sponsor, of course, Mrs. Wilson is at the top. What the Chinese see in Mei Lanfang, so we already have a narration of a Chinese perspective on Mei Lanfang. By the way, we have all the Chinese texts also. These are all translations, right? So based on that, of course, all of these books later on were published, mostly written by a few men, especially by Qi Wushan. So Mei Lanfang's art, right, his head, neck, so you have a detailed description of the performing art as in, so they had to really understand, they have to narrate, to write how this art is going about. Peking Opera, even till today, is pupil and master, right? I teach you how to move, that's how you move, right? Now they're forced to actually notate this art. The character type of Chinese drama, that's all the characters. The original place of the female impersonator in Chinese opera, obviously that's a big problem, right? For modern society, how could a man play a woman, right? So they had to deal with this. Of course, they deal with this in the Shakespearean area and so on and so forth. Pantomime, they started to introduce the art, how an actor moves, to come with the theory. And they did 370 paintings, hand-painted, of the entire wardrobe, every aspect of traditional theater, now we have on paper. Not only on paper, but in color, right? All the different roles. So it's like a visual library that we are gaining. Face masks, they basically rescued many of this very valuable archive and repainted them. All the instruments used in Peking Opera was painted. All the extra stage props were painted. Beautiful instruments, right? And on top of that, Mei Lanfang's dance movement had now a dance manual. Every movement in every dance, they tried to paint it. This, in China, if you look at even after 1949 of dance manual, they just say turn right, turn left. It's all verbal. There's very few dance manual shows such in detail. This for American audience. It was done. In great detail, of course, Mei Lanfang's, especially the Tian Yu San Hua, is also big painting. By the way, some of these paintings are still there. Some of them are lost. I think they're newly published, actually, whatever is reserved. You can see the dynamism, right? You can almost capture the dynamism of the top, of the dance. Out of this, Peking Opera also gained an acting manual. This is what you do when you sleep, right? So from the pupil to master, master to pupil, we now have a trove of printed guides. This is when you are pensive, when you are thinking, 思绪. This is when you are shy, when you are embarrassed. It is a coded language that was represented visually. When you're there's a whole series, and Mei Lanfang's museum have published most of these. This is how you sit. Of course, it's a Qingyi, but anyway. This is how you stand, and the introduction of stored. And this is the dance of the drunken beauty, or 贵妃醉酒. So I don't have time now to. I'm time out, right?
10 more minutes.
Huh?
You have 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes. Okay. So But what is really interesting to me is that that in America and in Japan and in Soviet Union, we have a Western theater practitioner, Western theater theorist engaging with Peking Opera. There's many things have written on it. Brecht is one of them, Meyerhold is one of them, and Charlie Chaplin is one of them. But what I find is the most important and the most, at that time, the theorist on theory in America is Stark Young, right? So Stark Young, he was in the 1930s the American czar of theater writing. So what did Mei Lanfang's troupe do? Before they went to 49th Street, they invited Stark Young. They explained through one act all the coded language of that Peking Opera aesthetics. Stark Young sat there and learned, and later on he said, it's untranslatable. It's a language you need to learn. But what he also said, I thought was really interesting. He writes, this Chinese theater brought to us by Mei Lanfang, far beyond anything in Western theater, is a theater that is pure and that is complete. The purity of this Chinese theater art consists in the fact that everything employed in it, action, facial expression, voice, movement, speech, the story, the place, and so on, is so subordinate to the artistic intention that the resulting work is in itself an entirely holy ideal, a work of art that no point to be mistaken for actuality. He writes many pieces on Chinese theater. I actually, in my paper, I go in quite detail. He compares, he said, Chinese theater is not without realistic aspect. It's like a Chinese painting. He goes in great detail that it looks imaginary, but you look at all the details, it's real. It's from life, right? It's like a memory of reality. So he really, in another article, he talks about, are we seeing the end of realism and the beginning of symbolic acting, right? That realism really has come to such a dead end. Is this the new epoch? So I mention this because Stark Young's article in the New Republic and many in newspaper, it was immediately translated by the group and sent back to China, right? So the position, how to understand Peking Opera, has this international circular dimension that to the Chinese reader, oh, it is abstract art. It has a place in modern culture. Oh, it's not the dregs of the old society. This is what the May 4th was saying. So we have a new voice, new cultural authority that is coming from outside. So by the time, so of course, Mei Lanfang is absolutely the dance, right? And his dynamic acting was very much involved. So by the time, I won't go through that, by the time he came to the Soviet Union, the whole Peking Opera's self-confidence is complete. It has devised an identity. It has a place in modern world. It has established itself as one of the world's highest achievement in theater aesthetics. Underneath that, much reform has been done. There was no dance in Peking Opera, right? So on and so forth. But it looks traditional. So in a way, I talk about this as the traditional modernity of Peking Opera, right? Actually, all cultures go through this. You can't live if you don't change. There's no way, right? So how do you change? It was the question. And they found the answer, the interaction with Western theater critic, with Western support, and actually join a Western discussion of theater modernity rather than with their own cultural elite. In so doing, 话剧, spoken drama, till today, very hard in China to find a popular audience, right? It is just, that is the most alienating form, right? And whereas Peking Opera, we still have, or traditional theater, especially Kunqu, now really have risen from the bottom, come up with lots of vitality. So I conclude by saying that the so-called tradition that Peking Opera was seen by the West, or how Peking Opera presented this tradition, is a recreation of the tradition. That tradition is recalculated, recalibrated in modern terms. 80% has been discarded. Dance enter that actually, for example, 兰花指. I have one photograph I thought was just really interesting. Actually, this photograph is one of my beginning curiosity about. This is Yang Guifei, the very famous new operas that Mei Lanfang has created. Everything is imagined, the tradition. The garment is imagined. Peking Opera, Dan actor, if you're a Qingyi, you never show your hands, not only your arm, right? The dance is new. The hairdo is new. They copied it from temple paintings. So the entire ensemble actually is a modern rendition. So in order to represent tradition, tradition has to be reinvented. Second, the consequence is that movement and dynamics. What is 20th century? Movement, right? This is the century of movement, not of stillness. And so singing relatively becomes not as important as movement, and this is still today. The Peking Opera found its position in the world and loudly rejected the May 4th cries. Later on, Hu Shi was a little bit mollified, actually helped Mei Lanfang about the American trip, but he was wrong on everything. Obvious point. Peking Opera modernity was completed or came to success through a global engagement. Thank you.